Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
You know, some of my favorite interviews that we do on the show are with women who give us the inside baseball on their private processes for sifting out the great men from the rest of the pack. And this episode is one of those interviews with a woman who has an incredibly discerning eye for identifying men who have that it factor when it comes to leading in life. And this woman is someone that you've heard me mention dozens of times on the show before, but this is her very first appearance. And she is here to unpack 5 things that she looks for to identify a great man. And that woman is Grace Gold. So who is Grace Gold? Well, Grace is a nationally known authority in the wellness and beauty spaces. She's been featured on all the major American networks like ABC, CBS, NBC. She's been on TV shows like The Today Show. Her writings have been featured in publications like Vogue, Marie Claire, and Redbook. But to me, she's just Grace. Grace is one of the most special people in my life because she and I met about 17 years ago. We spent our first few years dating before we transitioned into a deep and loving friendship. She's like a sister to me over this last decade and a half. And if you've listened to the show before, you know that Grace is the catalyst. She's the one who's responsible for pointing me on the personal development and inner work journey. Especially back in 2009, where I had the rockiest patch up until that point in my life where I questioned how I was living my life, why I felt so lost, why I'd hit bottom in so many of my behaviors. And she was the one who pointed me to personal development, bought me the 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, pointed me to The Way of the Superior Man by David Deida, and she unleashed the beast that is me today. I would not be here behind this podcast, not leading a revolution of men doing inner work, if it weren't for Grace's intervention in my life. And she's one of the most special human beings that I depend upon for guidance. It's amazing that she's here today to be sharing with you some of her insights on how she identifies men who lead in their lives, men who are capable of greatness. So in this episode, Grace is going to give you 5 ways that she and other women identify a man who is leading in his life. She talks about why a man who is dissatisfied by his life, but drags himself like to show up in that very same life in the very same way every day, is not a man who she trusts and clearly not a man who leads. Why men who settle in any area of their lives, whether it's settle for their career, settle for their relationships with friends that are no longer serving them, is such a major turnoff. She talks about how women have a sixth sense for men who are lying to themselves and how that's a surefire way to lose her trust and her turn on. And by the way, throughout this episode, Grace gives a lot of examples from my 24-year-old Dominic and, parts of my journey where, I was lying to myself, and we talk candidly about that. So I'm sure you'll enjoy that. Why men who read books that are written by women and also men who have legitimate platonic female friends are strong indicators of a man who truly respects women. And then finally, the one word that Grace used in her dating profiles, the one word that exposed and filtered out men who are not great men. This is a tactic that's ingenious, and I've actually been a part of that social experiment of hers over the past few years. That's fascinating. That'll come up at the end of the episode. Stick around for that. Enjoy this very special discussion today with one of the most important people in my life, Grace Gold. 5 ways women identify a man who leads in life. Brian, this is a special day for me, man, because we're talking about integrating all these parts of our lives. This is like a seminal moment for me because you have been such a central part of my life for the last 5 years. And we are bringing on a guest, a woman who's been central to my life over the last 20 years, who I've talked about probably in every other episode on the show, Grace Gold. Welcome. and like meet each other. So this is your the first times talking to each other, right?
Yes. Thank you so much for having me on. And I'm so excited to chat with you, meet you too, Brian.
Yeah, great to meet you. Whenever I meet somebody new like this, I'm like, is this person a hugger? Like, does she like to hug or does she not like to hug? But
Definitely.
You're a hugger. Okay, but thanks to coronavirus, I no longer have that as an option. But if we were in person, big hugs to you.
Thank you.
I'm probably going to struggle a few times over the course of our conversation today, Grace, because I know you by a different name. I know you as Melissa, because that's how you came into my life 20 years ago. And a part of our story is, you know, we dated about 20 years ago or something like that. Now, how long has it been, actually?
I was 21, 20. So it's almost been 20 years.
Yeah, you were still at NYU, because I remember coming to your graduation. I was recently graduated from the University of Richmond. And Brian, as I was telling you before we started recording, like to give you some insight on how like savvy Grace is, when you were building your business out online about like 10 or 11 years ago, you recognized that Melissa Goldberg was like a name that a lot of women shared, and two other women in your industry shared the same name. So like getting that Google territory, that search engine optimization space was like a challenge. So you took your middle name, which was Grace, shaved off the Berg at the end of your name and went Grace Gold for alliteration. And now you dominate the search engine optimization rankings.
Yes. And, you know, along with that, Grace, my middle name, was my grandmother's name. And my mother is an immigrant, and she chose Melissa out of a baby book name. It was the most popular name in 1981 because she wanted me to be as Americanized as possible. And she just wanted to pick, you know, a name that sounds very American. And my whole life, Melissa has never felt like my name. So part of that also was, you know what? I've always wanted my grandmother's name, and it works also marketing wise. So I decided to do it.
I did not know that. See, we get to have these kinds of conversations where we still get to learn about each other, even though I feel like I know almost all of those kind of historical elements within the first few minutes. We're already off to the races.
Dominic, what's your middle name?
Peter.
Is it really?
Yeah, Peter. It's always a surprise. I don't seem like it has like really very little resonance with me, but that was my grandfather's name.
There it is. Peter Quartucci. Yeah, I think you stick with Dominic. This is better.
Yeah.
Don't pull a Grace Gold.
No, I won't go with Peter Quartuccio. Yeah. One of the reasons why Bri, like you wanted to call her the Grace Gold is because, you know, we've talked about her, or I've talked about you so much as coming into my life in a way where you forever changed the trajectory of my life. Like I would say that I grew up in a really whitewashed, sheltered, kind of narrow world. I was kind of this white dude who played sports, who liked to drink beers, and wasn't really curious about much beyond that. And when you and I started dating, you know, like 18 years ago, whatever it was, you were staying in on Friday, Saturday nights and studying. I'm like, who the hell does that? You were reading the New York Times instead of like, you know, whatever gossip magazines. And you would send me articles. I'm like, who the hell reads New York Times at 18 years old? And you also have a diverse background, right? Like you're talking about Indian mother, Jewish father. You were the one who exposed me to worlds way beyond my narrow focus. That continued to proliferate through my life when it came to personal development. You were the person who turned me towards personal development. I credit you for creating this monster. So I'm just curious from your perspective, like what did you see me go through in terms of like, who was I when I showed up at your doorstep, and who do you see me as today?
You were such a bro when I first met you. Like, and from Jersey, just a bro. That's how I would describe you. But you, even back then, were a curious bro. So you always had a very deep curiosity, an open mind. You were excited by new experiences and learning new things. And I felt like I really connected with you on that. And it's just been amazing to see how much you've changed. I mean, I remember even sort of introducing you to the idea of like self-improvement. I talked about Landmark, which you had no interest in doing. But I think you've talked about seeing the transformation that I was undergoing, and you were curious. You wanted to know what it was that I was doing and what could change me so much. So just seeing you come so far, the 24-year-old Dom would not believe who the 41-year-old Dom is. And I think it's just been amazing, and it's been so wonderful to see. And you've just been such a rock in my life because as you've grown, you've also just been so helpful in so many facets of my life as well.
Thank you.
Grace, I've seen you comment often on some of Dominic's posts on Facebook or Instagram. And I'm curious, after knowing Dominic for this long, dating Dominic and seeing what the 24-year-old Dominic looked like, what goes through your mind when you see those posts? What do you feel like?
I literally think about that 24-year-old Dominic, and I sometimes see him over my shoulder as I'm reading these posts, like, dude, I cannot believe that's me, you know? Whoa.
What would 24-year-old Dominic say about the current post that this Dominic is posting?
Right. Is he appalled by me?
I think he thinks you're a little out there.
Yeah.
Dominic is a little out there. I mean, who are we kidding here?
I can totally see that. There's some shit that I post sometimes where I'm even like, what the fuck am I talking about right now? You know, Brian, are there any other curious questions that you have? Because I mean, Grace has really seen, like, has been at the epicenter of some of like these pivotal moments in my life. And so, like, are there any other questions? Because she'll give you the dirt, man. Like, is there anything that you'd be curious about?
I struggle probably the most, Dominic, with going back to old friends and seeing who this version of Brian is now. And so I've got a lot of questions for the Grace Gold related to Dominic. But first, just want to honor this relationship, your relationship, because not only was she an instigator for growth for you, but she's also supported that growth and who this new Dominic is. And sometimes that's really, really hard for people to look at this person and not say like, yeah, but I knew that 24-year-old Dominic, this guy's full of shit, because it's not. You are a different human being. So I think it's a really beautiful thing, and what a cool place to go back to and talk. But yeah, as far as questions go, for sure. What did you see in 24-year-old Dominic? What was the initial spark that you're like, this is maybe somebody I want to get to know?
Well, it was that curiosity. And Dom was doing interesting things. He was a hard worker. He was working on himself a little bit in those early days, you know, small steps.
Was he doing lots of push-ups? Because that hasn't changed.
Oh, yeah. He was doing lots of push-ups. But he would be putting down burritos every day. I think that's changed.
Sometimes that's changed, but you can actually get a really good gauge of my emotional state of being. It's perfectly correlated to how many burritos I'm eating, right? So if I'm eating burritos, you know that like I'm going through some shit. And this past week, I've eaten some burritos. Okay.
Totally. I have to say, one thing that's really helped as he has grown as a person and become so mature in so many ways is still at the end of the day, he's got the bro humor going on. So I feel like that part of Dom is there, and I don't have to worry about him losing his sense of humor.
Yeah, I'm not above a toilet joke. Give me Ace Ventura and you know, Dumb and Dumber. Like I'm not above any of that. I seem to be a little bit more refined in other areas of my life right now.
This is true.
So awesome. Thanks for taking down the reminiscent trail. And there's so many other stories that I would love to share about like our relationship. But what I really wanted to bring you on to talk about today, Grace, is you have always had such an eye for men who lead, for seeing potential in men beyond their present state. And I know that because like you have constantly spoken to the highest version of me. Not the present day version of me. When I was 24 years old, you were not talking to the man in front of you. You were talking to the man that you saw me capable of. And that's why like so many of our interactions have called me forward in life, like unleashing this personal development monster inside of me. And so you've also found other men in your life that you've either dated or cultivated relationships with who are doing big things in this world as well. And what I thought would be an awesome conversation for us to have is like, what are some of those things that you see inside of men that quickly identify themselves as leaders in your eyes, right? Like the great man characteristics that you call out, that you seem to be able to see faster than other people, that you seem to identify and be able to articulate in a way that I think others could really benefit from. So I would just love to kind of go down your list on, you know, like what are some of those key things that you look for, you see in a man that makes you know instantly that guy's got some stuff?
Right. So let's start number one. I know people talk about purpose a lot. But I really think of it as sort of a master of his domain. Whatever it is that he does, he excels in whatever it is he's decided to do with his life. And it's driven by that constant curiosity, like that I mentioned that I saw in you. And listen, when people are young, if you're listening to this and you're young, you're 20 or when we met, when you were 24, you're starting out in life. You don't have control generally over your job. And, you're in a position that everybody has to work their way up, right? Yeah. So what I saw in you, even in your job at that time at Prudential, was even though you weren't, so crazy about the hours and the demands, you were constantly looking for ways to grow in it and to have more and more control over your schedule, over what it was that you were doing in the company. You were gravitating towards mentors and your talents and really, bringing them to the forefront. I look for that immediately. Someone who hates their job and drags themselves to it every day is not a leading man. And again, you can be starting out. People have all kinds of challenges and circumstances. You might be in a job you're not crazy about, but there's a plan and there's somewhere that you see yourself going. Another thing, a lot of guys often talk about the things they want to do, but you don't see the action happening. So is this someone who has a vision for where they want to go, for becoming a master of their domain, and they're actually taking actionable steps? Another aspect I want to bring up about being a master of your domain is having the maturity to always have the beginner's mind. I forget what it's called. There's a phrase for it. I know in the yoga world, the beginner's mind. It's that curiosity and that openness. It's not being jaded, right? People become masters of their trade and then they're jaded and they think they know everything and they have a very closed mind and they don't want to hear new ideas. So also being a master of your domain is having that beginner's mindset, that curiosity, that openness to learn. And then I would say another part of that as well, of being the master of your domain, is wanting to have more control over your time and your schedule. I have to say most of the men that I have dated that have been leaders ultimately tend to be self-employed or be in kind of work where they control their schedule. And this all helps them, of course, align with the kind of life they want to lead, the morning routine they have, what their day looks like. They're not answering to someone constantly, or they're moving to a way to not have to answer to someone constantly. These are all masters of their domain.
Grace, it sounds like what it starts with, and you mentioned this earlier in the podcast, is this idea of openness, of being curious, which is a linchpin to growth. And so it sounds like Dom always had that, but there's two other things that I want to make sure I have right. The first is to have a vision of what's desired, what you want, as opposed to, you mentioned guys that hate their job. Like that's not somebody that you're going to date. So it's having a vision of what you want. But then here's the big one that I heard you say, and also taking steps, taking action to move towards that. And I'm curious what you've seen in Dominic, because this process for him, and you've known him for a long time, has been a long process. It wasn't the 24-year-old Dominic that said, I'm leaving Prudential and starting my own business. And so I'm curious what you've seen, the steps that he's taken on that journey and to execute the vision that maybe he even described to you back then.
Sure. Well, look, Dom, I remember when you were working at Prudential in those days, you had long hours. They would be sending you up to Rochester and all these Hartford, and you'd be taking these drives that you hated. And you weren't necessarily waking up excited to do these things, but you were constantly at your workplace seeking out mentors that would help you move up and move up fast. You were developing skills. I remember you had the personal coaching within the workplace. You were exploring options that your workplace allowed you to do to develop yourself better within the company. And you would share a lot of that with me, which was also fantastic. It was great. And you were creative. You were thinking of ways where you could move in the company, things you could do, things that you can bring to the workplace that they gave you more and more leadership within the organization. And you got more and more control of your schedule and what you wanted to focus on as well. And that took years. You're right, Brian. That's not an overnight thing. It definitely takes years. And you went from there to consulting to finally running your own business. I think you want to be realistic. You don't want to expect these kind of things when you're starting out, if you're listening to this when you're young, but it is about taking those steps.
It's really interesting hearing you describe your perspective of my experience. And as I'm listening to it, it was kind of like I was this curious guy inside this little ecosystem that I used to work in, like Prudential. And then, trying to find my way to gain more control, become more of a master of my own domain inside of that little sliver. And now as I look at the life that I'm creating now, it's like, whoa, that, I kind of blew the top off of that little silo of Prudential. And now I'm the master of my domain in all of these integrated areas of my life, and constantly seeking, like, how do I bring together my passion, my personal development into my work? How do I bring people in my life that I love, like you two, together to create a movement in the world? So it's fascinating to see like the seeds of that you describe right now, which is really kind of cool to see how it's unfolded. And I want to double click on one thing that you said. I wrote it down, which is a man who hates his job and drags himself to it every day is not a leading man, right? That is really powerful. Like, you can even expand that to say a man who hates his life, or not even hates his life, but a man who is like restless or dissatisfied with his life, but drags himself to it every day doing the same stuff. That's not a leading man, right? That's a man that's in drift. I don't say that with judgment, because I was that man in certain areas of my life, in certain periods of time in my life, just like dragging myself through the mundane, through the motions, and hiding from the fact that like I wanted more, like I wanted more for my life, but didn't have the courage or the direction or the support network to go get it. That's a piercing statement. So I just wanted to say thank you for it. What's your next one?
Yes. My next one is that men who lead, they don't settle. That feeling of settling is so pervasive when someone does that to their life. And we were just talking about career. So you don't settle for that soul-sucking job. So many people settle. They think this is just the way things are. I make a great paycheck. Or I remember there was somebody I went on one date with once who told me how much he hated his job, but then he gets his Christmas bonus, working in finance in New York City. And he's like, you know what? It's not that bad. That feeling of settling really, it leaches into all parts of your life. Friends are another place where I see men settle, where, like they're convenient, or they've got some kind of toxic relationships.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, friends who are a sort of a bad influence in areas where they're trying to improve within themselves. But, these are my buddies, and you know what? It's hard making new friends. It's uncomfortable. But that settling of like when you see a guy and he's surrounding himself with just people who are not helping him be his best self, or even posing challenges to him working on himself, making fun of him or whatever it is. And people I don't want to be around with as well. Like when you're dating somebody, who they surround themselves with is going to be who's surrounded as well.
Grace, I think something that you've really it hit me in the heart when you said it was that it's not when somebody settles in their job, let's say, when somebody settles with their job, it's not just about their job. It's pervasive throughout their life. And I know I've been guilty of believing that I can segment my life. I can quarantine parts of my life and be like, well, I'm going to settle in over here. I'm not going to settle over here. And it's all bullshit. And what I'm gathering from you in your mature feminine can see that and can call it out and be like, nope, that's disgusting actually, that you're settling either in a job or in a relationship or whatever else. But this idea that we can put barriers around different parts of our life is bullshit.
I got to hit this one, man, because last night I was being interviewed on a podcast by someone else, and it was about like how men lose credibility with women, because that was one of our most popular episodes with Madeline Moon, and we talked about this exact concept of women don't trust a guy who uses compartmentalization as a life strategy. Compartmentalization is what got me into all my trouble in my life, right? The public Dominic, the private Dominic. you can compartmentalize in short-term scenarios, right? Compartmentalization is helpful. Like when shit goes down in my business early in the week, instead of being like angry, crying, feeling into my emotions in the moment, it's like, let's put on my solutions hat and like get through this crisis and I'll deal with the emotions later. But if we are like segmenting off all of my emotions and never dealing with them, compartmentalizing, we are not compartmentalizable human beings, and women can see right through that. That's why like I was never fully trustworthy in a relationship up until now, right? And there's still compartments that I have to unwind. But Grace, this point that you're talking about here, especially with friends, is super important because I think this would be an area that a lot of guys would skip over. And I know that a lot of the men who are listening to the show are finding themselves at a crossroads because the more you do inner work, the more you start to change and grow, there are going to be disparities. There's going to be distance between you and the people who have no interest in doing that. And there's this friction point of, are you going to just settle and maintain those relationships, or are you going to have the courage to try and call those relationships forward or leave those relationships? And that is one of the, I would say, one of the anchors that keeps a lot of guys stuck is not addressing that. So thanks for naming that.
Absolutely. And also what Brian was talking about, my last point on the don't settle, is women can tell when men lie to themselves. Right? When you're making up, well, my job sucks, but I have this retirement plan, or I don't have enough time really to work on this. And my friends, I've known them for these lies that you tell yourself. I think sometimes you don't realize how ridiculous it sounds because it's in your head. Maybe if you try and like verbally say it and explain it. I remember us doing an exercise once in Landmark where they just had us verbalize why the biggest sticking point in our life was that sticking point. It sounded ridiculous when I was saying it over and over and over again verbally to somebody. I mean, that's what it sounds like when you're lying to yourself about settling.
See, Brian, can you imagine how hard it was as a 24-year-old Dominic to be dating Grace? Because I couldn't pass any of my bullshit off through her. She's just
all your games out the window. You had to actually confront all the crap that was going on internally. I get it. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful.
Totally.
I mean, people want to talk about going to Landmark or going to see Tony Robbins or reading books. If you want to level up your life, if you're heterosexual and attracted to the feminine, go date someone that's very mature in their feminine and see how you do. Because that will level up because there's no choice. It's almost like, it's like physics. This is how it works.
Yeah. And like my most triggering moments were when you would be calling me out on my bullshit. Like when I'd be lying to myself and then I would be defensive. And then later I would come back with my tail between my legs and be like, fuck, you got that right.
Do you remember any of those specific moments?
Well, so Grace brought me to Landmark Forum a year before I ended up going, right? So she brought me to the Landmark Forum because it was something that was like really benefiting her life. If you don't know the Landmark Forum, it's basically this 3-day experience where like you wake up to these kind of drift, it's a big drift sledgehammer for 3 days. And I remember going to this like intro session where I was completely turned off because Landmark does some crappy shit that like, it'll turn off a lot of people. There was part of that, but I rejected this opportunity to look at myself. I just judged everyone else for how they didn't know how to get off the couch and live a life of their own design. So I was judging other people. For the next year, I watched Grace triple her income in her business. I watched you break free from being like a shy, soft-spoken person to like writing publicly. And eventually now you're on national television on like the largest TV shows in the country, crushing it, like the Today Show, Good Morning America, et cetera. And I think when I broke down at the end of that year, at the age of 30, like I came to you and I was just like, okay, I realized that I can't do this on my own, that I don't have all the answers, that I have been lying to myself. You met me with a compassionate open arms. You bought me The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, The Way the Superior Man by David Data, and said, sign up for the Landmark Forum. And that ended up all happening, in January of 2010, which was where I began my journey. So yeah, that was one of those times.
It's funny, Dominic. I remember you and I I don't know if you'll remember this, but there's a place down in the East Village that you and I met up really early in our relationship. And it was very similar to what Grace brought you, where I looked at you and I was like, all right, how you doing this? Like what, like I see you growing. I see you doing stuff publicly. It's kind of bold. How do you do it? Where do you start? And I remember at that time, you were like, I don't know, man. I've been just on a massive journey. And so you couldn't possibly tell me at that time, like, well, I know this woman named Grace Gold and she told me to do this. And, because it was like a grouping of things. But I do remember you said, I don't know, Brian, like, go check out Landmark Forum. You should really read The Way of the Superior Man. That's where I started. And that was really, I mean, that was probably 5 years ago at least.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the things that I'm passionate. Like I'm grateful that I was a major cause in your life to start doing this inner work, because Grace was mine. One of the things that I keep finding is the number one way men still find their way on this inner journey is because a woman pointed them to this path, right? Like most guys who have never learned how to be vulnerable with other guys will go to a woman in their life, like I did with you, Grace. Like you were the only person I could come to at that time that I trusted, that I felt safe, that wouldn't judge me. But like, I want to change that. I want the number one way that men get on this inner path is like for men to bring other guys on, And I think that's what you and I are doing as a big part of this show.
Grace, I wanted to tell you a big thank you, because by you sending Dominic down this journey, it also sent me years later down this journey and has allowed me to attract the woman of my dreams into my life and start businesses and everything else. And so this has a investment residual effect when we start down these paths. So I don't know if that makes you my inner work grandmother, maybe. I don't know how this works, but thank you.
That's so great. Thank you for sharing.
If we're brother, sister, maybe aunt. Maybe she's your inner
aunt.
work aunt.
Auntie, Indians say.
Great. So what's the third one?
Really important. Does he build relationships everywhere he goes? Because someone who you want to build a quality relationship with you does that inherently. And Dom, as much of a Belmar type of bro as you were when I met you, you did that always, naturally. And when I talk about building relationships everywhere, when he's like, I want to take you to my favorite restaurant. I go here all the time. Do the people there know him, or is he anonymous? Service staff. There's a lot people talk about how does he treat the waiter, the waitress. Of course, that says a lot. And I'm not talking about tipping, right? Because there's lots of wealthy guys in New York that I've dated who can hand over a 20 and people are all about, service. I'm not talking about service people in that way. Does he know the name of the kids of his front door person? Does he know the UPS guy? If these are regular people in his life. When he takes you to a regular spot, because that's often a dating thing, let me take you to my favorite spot. Do people know him? Does he grow relationships wherever he goes? This will tell you a lot if he's going to grow a quality relationship to you. And I find it very alarming, honestly, when I go out with somebody and they're just very anonymous and they're bringing me to a place that's special for them. And, we're in New York City, right? This is a very anonymous area. There's an anonymity to going to restaurants, but if there's a place that he's always at, the folks should know him. A leading man, people know him where he goes because he builds those relationships. He's grateful. He treats people well. It just happens naturally.
I'm curious, Grace. I would love to be more of that guy where I go places and people are like, Brian's here. Yay. Like, let's talk. I'm curious, how has Dominic or other guys that you've dated, what have you seen them do that allows them to build the relationships naturally?
Just takes an interest in people. And I'm glad that you bring that up because, look, I'm an introvert. I'm not like walk into the room, life of the party type of person. I'm a quiet person, but I connect with people. And it is that curiosity about people, just wanting to know that, someone's okay or they're having a great day, or you're the kind of person who ask someone how they are, or you relate to them, or if something embarrassing happens or something goes wrong, you make them feel better. In those little moments, people really, especially service people, really appreciate you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, like Grace and I, like a good example of this is I live in a doorman building here in New York City, and Grace will come and stay here every so often. Like when I'm traveling, if I'm on for a week or something, Grace has stayed here in my apartment, and my doorman, Anthony, and my doorwoman, Darlene, like the two of them, I have like a really close relationship with. I'll stop when I come back home from whatever, like Whole Foods or from a trip, and just like shoot the shit with them for 10 or 15 minutes. I know about their families. I know about their personal lives. Sometimes that can feel like a burden. Sometimes I just want to go in and out of the building and I get caught up in the conversation. There is a cost to that, but this is my home. These are the people who protect my home. These are people who I care about. And I bring that kind of mentality to all of the places that like Grace, you're saying is special to me, whether it's like the Equinox or the assemblage that it used to be. Like I knew the service people for those reasons. And it wasn't because like I wanted to be some special dude. It was because like I see the importance of those people in creating this like environment that I find special. And I think that's what you're naming, Grace.
Yeah, definitely. It's about creating that feeling of community that you want in a relationship, that women want in a relationship. I mean, if he doesn't do that naturally in other areas of his life, how do you expect him to do that with you in building a relationship?
Sometimes it's important. Dominic and I often will look at extremes on this podcast to provide some context for the entire situation. And I can tell you the opposite of what you're describing right now. I know a woman who married a guy and their relationship was great, but he had all kinds of conflict seemingly with everybody else, whether it was somebody at a hotel or a restaurant or even her friends. But she always gave the excuse internally that, well, him and I are great. People just don't get him. He's a little rough around the edges. Eventually that turned around. And when the divorce ensued, all of those traits came back tenfold on her. Mm-hmm. And so when you mentioned before about it's pervasive throughout the life, it can't be compartmentalized. Like these things, even connecting with other people in other relationships, are an indicator for who the man is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
So either you're building relationships or you're you're not.
Yeah, it's like how a man treats other people will eventually be how he treats you, right? Because that compartmentalization thing is, and you just gave a great example of that. It's an illusion. So yeah, that's one of the things you also taught me, Grace, is like you said that, you would always look at how did I treat the people, like either the taxi driver or, the service folks, or you look for those small little things as indicators to like, how is he going to treat me? Like when we really go deep into the relationship. So that was awesome. What's your fourth one?
The fourth one is that continuous self-improvement, right? That curiosity, that constant evolving person. I mean, it keeps things interesting too. So you're not dating the same person for your whole life. Someone who just wants to constantly better themselves or just even learn new things. It makes them a more interesting person. And part of that is they're able to listen. This can be a big thing with guys. A lot of guys really don't know how to listen. Sort of taught within the masculine too. The toxic masculine in this country. Part of that is, men who lead, they are always readers. They read. I wish I could tell you like why that is, but there's, I guess, just that curiosity, that ability to sit down with words and digest them and think about them. If a guy doesn't read, that is such a red flag that he's never going to be in this category.
To that point, Grace, there was a quote I saw the other day that said, "Never trust a man whose television is bigger than his bookshelf." And then that's a good one. I wish I would have come up with that, which is awesome. Good. And then the magnet that sits on my fridge that our mutual friend Lauren bought me, which is, if you go home with someone and they don't have books, don't fuck them.
So true. Yes. And part of that continuing self-improvement is also not having the fear of changing his mind, right? Like, how you pick up on some people right away that what they believe is what they believe and they are not going to change their mind. And this is how things are. You can also pick up on somebody when they just have that open mind and they can entertain ideas that they don't agree with. And I think that goes along with reading, it's just something that comes to you. And part of this too is it's an opportunity when somebody is constantly evolving that they want to share their experiences with you, to go on yoga retreats, to do things together. I mean, this is part of what enhances a relationship as well. And I believe in people also taking their own time to sometimes work on their own self-improvement privately. But it's such a great thing when couples can do that together, whether it's physical, you're going on something where you're improving yourself, challenging yourself on a hiking trip, or it's spiritual, or whatever it is. I mean, it's just such a great part of a relationship.
How have you seen guys balance what seem like opposing needs to be this guy, this leadership guy? On one hand, very open, willingness for change. On the other hand, making decisions, moving forward, executing. Seems like there may be some tension between those sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's just the openness, right? Maybe you're making a decision and you're open to listening to ideas while you've still got what you think you're going to do in the background, but you're open to listening to ideas and maybe you integrate some of it, but you're able to make that decision. It's having that ability to hold both. And I think that's important to point out because life is really about having the ability to hold both.
Yeah, what I think, I'm not sure if it was Hemingway or someone who said like the test of a first-rate mind is to be able to hold two mutually opposing viewpoints and not explode. One of the things about toxic masculinity, I guess we would call it, is being just like unrelentingly rigid, is like holding a belief and then like not even entertaining anything else. But like something that's a powerful masculine is maybe being able to put up boundaries, but also having like gates, doors that can open, right? For something maybe like we haven't necessarily anticipated or believed in or saw, so that we can be open to influence that will upgrade us. That's part of what I'm hearing you say. I get that right?
Yes, definitely. And I think what you said triggered an idea. It's about not taking ideas personally, right? Like you can feel that energy when a guy takes stuff personally and it like offends him to entertain an opposing idea. Whereas the energy is totally different when you can listen to it. You know, I don't mean to bring up landmarks so much, but a friend of mine really couldn't handle it because they didn't agree with what was being said. And it was so personal to them that this is wrong. This is not how it is. You know, they thought it invalidated a lot of their struggle in life. And I'm just like, dude, just like sit. Like, it doesn't have to be right or wrong. Like, just listen to it for a weekend. Take what you want. Don't take what offends you, but like, it's not right or wrong. Just like hang out with it. And so what I'm talking about is guys being able to hang out with new ideas.
Dig it. Nice. Well, I think that goes into this last category, which is a really powerful one. I'm glad you saved this one for last. What's your fifth one?
Yes. Well, men who lead genuinely respect women. So important. You can ask any guy, you can ask raging sexists if they respect women. Right. And they will say, oh, of course I do. Of course I would vote for a woman. Of course I would do this. Genuine admiration for women. How does he actually treat the women in his life? Look at that. Does he have real platonic women friends? This is such a difference between basic guys and men who lead because they can't even look at a woman, a basic guy, without thinking about intimacy or what is she doing for me? So they will not have platonic women friends. And I'm not talking about like acquaintances that like they talk to on social media. I mean, like they spend time with them. They might have lunch with them. They're actual friends. Along these lines, what is views on women politicians? This is something where like I saw a poll that everybody was making a big deal out of a month ago about how men are ready to elect women and they want to elect women. I'm sure if you ask people, sure, they'll tell you that. Okay, who has he actually voted for? Do you find that politicians are very interesting because they are a confluence of femininity and power? He might say that he's open to the idea, of course, pretty much everybody does. But do you find that every woman politician he finds too abrasive? There's just something wrong with them. They talk in a way that offends him. He thinks they're all corrupt. It's a big barometer how he feels about women politicians. Does he have somebody he likes, whatever side of the aisle he's on? Or is there always that, but she's too...
Yeah, shrill or too this or too that. She's too demanding. She's too, man-hating, like all that stuff.
All that stuff, yeah. Along these lines, look at what he's reading. Does he read women authors?
That's a big one.
Yeah.
That's a big one, right? I think I've talked about this a few times on the show, like where, 4 or 5 years ago, I looked at my bookshelf and I was like, holy shit, the 20 books I read this year, 19 were written by white guys. I didn't even notice that I was so narrow in my focus. And it was like, what about these other perspectives? And that's when I started reading books like authors like Glennon Doyle and Elizabeth Gilbert and then, Marie Kondo and Octavia Butler, Roxane Gay. Those are perspectives that have super, super expanded just how I show up in my own life, but also how I navigate conversations with women. There's so much gold in there about women's life experiences, especially from an early age, and societal norms that many women have subscribed to or feel imprisoned by that I was completely blind to. You and Lauren were the ones who made sure when Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In came out that I was the one to read it. I remember like you, Lauren, and Elmira put me on a group text message and made this big deal out of like, this is the book that every man leader needs to read. And I was one of the first male leaders inside of Prudential to read it. And I bought it for my sales team. It actually catapulted me as a man who was doing the work, who was a champion for women, because I actually took the time to read the book. I bet most guys inadvertently have completely shut off women authors because like, oh no, that's a book written for women. Why would I read it?
Exactly. To that point, this is a blind spot that I even find among men who lead. Like this tends to be a last thing that they do notice. And it's so funny that you say that about yourself, because I was going to mention that regardless of your experience, because the self-improvement world is so masculine. The leaders are so male. It is like that feeling, like you said, that if a woman writes it, that this is somehow for women. And so I do look, and I sometimes do bring that up to guys who are leaders. And if I notice that there's no women on that bookshelf, or he's never consuming art, entertainment, music created by women, he's just living in this male-dominated world, it's often a blind spot, even among men who lead.
Totally. TV shows, movie casts, like, are they always male leads? And to watch shows like, I've even had men say when I'm like, oh yeah, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, I love that show. Isn't that a chick show? One of my favorite new shows on Netflix is Ratched. And that's like a primarily female cast. Even like Sex and the City, which was Grace's like favorite show. And I remember back in the day when I was still my bro, when like we bartered to go to a movie, like you kind of like, I think I fucked something up once and you're like, well, you have to repay me by coming to the Sex and the City movie premiere. And I was like so ashamed of going into the movie theater and being like, how am I going to maintain my man card? Like, I'm not even kidding you about that. And then secretly, like really being enthralled by the episode itself. I'm like, wow, this is really entertaining. Just like all of that stuff. It's even a masculinity thing, Bri. Like, like I'm not going to watch that show because I'm not a pussy. And it's like, once I finally got over that, then like everything took a different flavor.
Yeah, definitely. And along with this is, how comfortable is he with the word feminist? I think I told you when I very much actively had a dating profile online, that would be the last line. I would stick that word in there. I remember on my OkCupid profile when I had that up, that the last section was, contact me if and people would list the things that really speak to them. And the last thing I wrote was, you're a feminist. And it was amazing what a barometer that was.
Yeah.
Because men who looked worldly and cultured and wrote me nice messages would not be able to contain themselves from saying, but I don't know if I'm a feminist, or I don't know about that feminist thing. It just turned into such a test of whether a guy really genuinely respected women, that I kept it there, and I've told women to do that, to stick that word in there.
So you've got these 5 amazing lessons that you get these gifts that you gave us, because then now we can inspect these areas of our life and say is this me? Is this not me? What needs to potentially change? So thank you for illuminating that. Now you are currently in partnership. I am so curious how that started and how you've used some of this, figuring out, is this the man that I want to currently be with?
Sure. Well, it's funny. I live in the New York City area. My partner lives in San Francisco. We met on OkCupid a few years ago. First of all, I knew about his business before he contacted me. So there's also that element, right, where is this just a person I want to get to know, whether or not there's any sparks whatsoever? And when he messaged me, I had known of his site, and I said, oh, wow, that's going to be an interesting coffee. Whether or not we agree on anything, whether this turns into a date or anything romantic, this is somebody I just want to get to know. So I think, that from the get-go, you just want to be somebody where whether or not it turns into something, you're an interesting person to know. And, you add value to people. And I would say that Marcos definitely embodies a lot of this. The self-improvement type of stuff, he's done that in different ways. He was initially a little hesitant about some of the things I suggested. It's so funny, Dom, I also got in the way of the superior man. And that really was a catalyst for him kind of being curious and exploring. Again, that curiosity is what led him, to the path of really working on himself in ways that he hadn't thought he needed to, and to develop himself as well. It's just that curiosity.
Yeah. One thing you have to learn about Grace is that she's committed to playing the long game. So if you resist the efforts, it's like she will wear you down. She will find the entry point and make it feel like you were the one who made the decision. You know what I mean? I eventually felt like, oh yeah, I'm the one who made the decision. But it was like you just kind of coming at it the right way. But Marcos, as I look through the list here, master the domain, don't settle, build relationships everywhere, continuously self-improve, genuinely respect women. I mean, Marcos is that guy, and he lives that. So Grace is eating her own cooking here for sure.
I Grace, speaking of a master of your own domain, Grace has figured out how to handle the male ego so gently and just penetrate it right in the soft spot. And it's good for us all, but it's not always easy to do.
You have to make him think it was his idea to begin with. That's really the secret to making a man do anything.
Do you consciously do that, or does it happen naturally?
It kind of happens naturally. Yeah. I mean, you lead them to the most tempting type of choice, right?
How many times did Dominic miss? So he eventually got it. He eventually, watched the movies and did this for him. How many times did he miss?
All the time. And here's the thing, she knew how.
I want to hear her answer.
How many times did I miss?
Plenty of times. Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you're an expert in a field, it's because you've made all the mistakes, right?
Yeah. As long as you've learned from them, right? And at least I've made so many mistakes that at least I learned from. But yeah, I mean, when you and I go into all women's groups, and then, we're sitting on the stage, and then there's women in the audience who go, how do I get my husband? How do I get my boyfriend? How do I get my brother? How do I get my boss? To actually pay attention to this stuff, to do this inner work. I always reference Grace's strategy and how she got me, which was she made invitations, not demands of me. And the invitations, she had to be committed to the long game, because I didn't respond to demands. I didn't respond to, you're broken, you need to be fixed. I didn't respond to that stuff, telling me what I need to do or that I'm wrong. I responded to, she spoke to the king inside of me. Dominic, I see how capable you are. I love how hard you work. And I know you want this for your life. Here's a book that men like you are reading, that other men who are in the position that you're climbing to have said is the most influential book or the most influential, workshop to go to. And she just kept doing that over time, speaking to the greatness inside of me. I was like, yeah, of course. How would I not want that? Well, this has been a beautiful conversation, taking a walk down memory lane. It's been beautiful for me to kind of see the two of you interact, and then Grace, just to kind of hear your perspectives of my journey, which is fantastic. Hopefully our listeners have really taken a lot of value out of the 5 points that you put up here, which I know that they will. Is there any final parting words or ways that people can find you that you want to leave us with?
Sure. Well, I guess I'll give my little Instagram a shout out, Ms. Grace Gold. You can always find me there and message me, and I'm happy to help out in any way that I can. And I think if you're listening to this podcast, you're obviously on the right track.
Yeah, Grace Gold approved.
Grace, are all of your ex-boyfriends amazing human beings like Dominic, or have there been some misses there too?
Don't make it to boyfriend status. If
Got it.
Very well said.
Good weed out system. I love it. Great to meet you, Grace.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Thank you, Grace. Hey, one of the indicators that Brian and I have that we just did a really powerful interview is when he and I walk away with new information that we didn't have before. And Grace gave us some of that information today, some real aha moments. And if you want to share your aha moments and want to continue the discussion, head over to the Facebook group, where we constantly have dialogues around episodes that just came out, men from around the world talking about their reflections, asking questions, sharing wins and success stories. So head over to Facebook, type in the Great Man Within podcast. It's a group for men only, and we've got a thriving community that's growing by the day. So head over, to Facebook, The Great Man Within Podcast, and we'll see you in the discussion.